Okay, today we begin with the Depression and how it affected the United States. For people in the cities, people were often evicted from their homes because they couldn't meet rent, and so they still had maybe hopefully employment in the city, and so they needed to find a place to live. And many people are going to move to what are called shanty towns, and these shanty towns were little towns that were made up of shacks things that people found, like pieces of wood or cardboard or tin that they put together in order to make some sort of a living arrangement for themselves on the outskirts of the cities. Within the cities themselves, they had a lot of urban poor, and so hunger is going to be a huge issue. In order to deal with that, soup kitchens will be created. And soup kitchens are going to offer food to the needy, sort of cafeteria style. You come in and you get a plate and you sit down and you eat your meal. But bread lines will also be offered as well. And bread lines, a lot of charities or public agencies are going to run these. And what they would do is put together like a bag of food, like bread and necessities, flour, that kind of stuff, and distribute food to the people who waited in lines for them. And then they could take the food home and prepare it themselves. In the rural areas, they didn't quite have the hunger issues the way that the cities will. And that's because farmers could grow food for their families. Even though crop prices fell and they weren't making a whole lot of money, they could still provide for their family in terms of food. Because crop prices fall, there are many times that they are not able to make their payments on their loans. And so many farmers faced foreclosure. And that's the process in which the mortgage holder takes over the property because payments are not being made. And so that was a constant sort of threat or problem that they were facing. In addition to that, as if that wasn't enough, the Dust Bowl is also going to be happening in the 1930s. And it's this huge drought that takes place in the 1930s. It covers the region from Texas all the way up to North Dakota, and it's basically because of exhaustion of the land, just overproduction. People weren't taking the right precautions in preserving the soil and that kind of stuff. There was very little grass or trees to hold the soil in place, and so when this drought hits, it just creates this huge dust storm, these dust storms that take place. We'll be watching a video in class that really hits on this. It's a great video about it. The hardest hit regions were Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas. Now, how did all this affect the American family? Well, obviously, they're going to have to make some cuts in their spending. And usually the first thing that you cut back on is entertainment. But there's going to be many other things that are going to be affected. We're going to look at the different groups, men, women, and children, and how each group is going to be affected by the Depression. For men, men were used to being the breadwinner. They're considered to be the breadwinner of the family, and many of them are unemployed. They lose their jobs. And so there's this loss of confidence, and some will even leave their families. About 2 million men are going to wander about the countryside, hitching rides. Eventually they'll become known as hobos, but the idea was that they're going to go find a job and they'll send money back. And in some cases they do, and in some cases they just abandon their families altogether. And the reason they have to do this is because there's no direct relief, and direct relief would be like cash payment or food that they could get from the government or from charities or public agencies, that kind of thing. Women, more women are going to have jobs because they could be paid less, and so oftentimes a company will hire women and replace their men instead, so that they could still have their workforce. They just wouldn't have to pay as much for them. But women on the farms are going to, and other places, are going to can food. They'll sew clothing rather than purchasing it ready-made. Working women with jobs, were kind of a target for resentment, because why should these women, especially married women, work when there were so many unemployed men who needed the jobs? A lot of people assume that women had it easier because they weren't seen begging or in the bread lines as much, but it was kind of a sign of pride that a lot of them were just, in their attic room, starving to death, because it was a pride thing. It was very hard. They were ashamed to admit their problems and to show that they were struggling, especially single women. Children, in some respects, you could probably say that children were hit the hardest because of the lack of nutrition that they get during their growing years. They had very poor diets because of the lack of food and lack of money to purchase appropriate food. There wasn't money for health care, and so a lot of them eventually developed health problems or had health problems at the time, like rickets or pellagra. Milk consumption was down, and so in their later years, as they get elderly, they have problems with calcium in their bone, not having enough calcium, and so they get all kinds of issues with that. Child welfare programs are going to decrease, and schools will shorten their school years, so they get less education. In some cases, the schools close up altogether because the children are going to go to work instead, where they can make some money to help out their families. So there's a lot of things that are happening, and it is a social and a psychological problem, as well as just being an economic problem. People were demoralized. Suicide rates are going to rise by almost 30% during the 1930s. 3 times more people are going to be admitted to mental hospitals because of mental breakdowns, and they just can't handle it, or because of depression themselves. Others will make sacrifices. They won't go to doctors or dental visits, and their health is at risk as a result, or it takes a hit as a result. Some people put off going to college because they don't think this is going to last that long, so they put off going to college, and as a result they never go to college like they had planned. Others will put off marriage or even having children, and this depression isn't over in just a couple years. It's like 10-12 years, and so you put off marriage and children for that long, and you might never have children as a result. So it is a huge impact on people. So what was Hoover doing in order to try and deal with this depression? Well, Hoover is going to encourage the people to go about their business as usual and kind of let the economy fix itself, sort itself out. And he's encouraged in this thought by his Secretary of the Treasury. And his Secretary of the Treasury was Andrew Mellon. And Andrew Mellon basically said, let's just have this do-nothing approach, that he advises Hoover to just let the crash liquidate itself. Once you hit rock bottom, there's nowhere else to go but up, right? And so get the problems out and then start over. Start from scratch. Start with a clean slate. That was kind of the advice that he's been being given. So Hoover's approach is going to be basically to do that, to do nothing. And so he's going to believe in very minimal government intervention, but he does want to help out the economy as much as he can, without interfering too much. So the key for him is to help without giving the government too much power, because that's what he was really concerned about. So if you look at Hoover's philosophy of how government should be, basically he has this view of humanitarianism. He wants to help others, but he wants to use reason in order to solve the problems of the economy, to solve the problems of the government, while maintaining that point of view of helping others. So what he thinks the government's main job is to get cooperation between competing groups, competing interests, but it must be voluntary. It can't be forced by the American government on the people. And so he calls it rugged individualism. And it's this ideal that people should succeed through their own efforts, that you put in the work, you get rewarded for your efforts. So people should be able to take care of themselves and their families. They shouldn't expect the government to bail them out. And so as a result, Hoover is going to oppose federal welfare, and he's going to oppose direct aid to the needy. He felt that would weaken people's self-respect, and it would weaken the nation's moral fiber, that people would come to depend on the government too much, and that we would never wean ourselves away from that. And so Hoover's answer, instead of the government helping out people, would be people helping out people, individuals or charities or local organizations pitching in to help out the needy. So Hoover's first steps in dealing with the Depression are not going to be to jump in with both feet with the government helping. Instead, it's going to be small baby steps that are going to be asking individuals to contribute. So his first step is to call the leaders of business and banking and labor to come to the White House and talk things out and try and come up with solutions to fix the economy. What can we do to make things better? The second is he's going to ask employers not to fire their employees or cut back on their wages, because that's just going to cause a panic. It's going to cause more problems. His third step is to ask labor leaders not to go on strike for higher wages, that they kind of need to understand what the situation is and realize that it's going to take time. It's not going to be an instant fix. And the fourth step is to create an organization that's going to gather contributions for the poor. But even though he attempted to do all these steps, it doesn't do much good. The economy still was shrinking and unemployment was still on the rise. So 1930 rolls around and it's an off-year election, and the Democrats win the congressional elections. The Republicans in Hoover had basically lost favor for not really responding to this depression, and so the Democrats win more seats in Congress. The result is that you've got Republicans who have lost control of the House. They lost the large majority in the Senate. They were down to a one-vote majority, and so you have this Republican president with a very Democratic Congress. So not much is going to be accomplished. Now, the American reactions to the Depression, the farmers really get up in arms. They begin to burn their corn and their wheat in the fields, because if they can't sell it for a profit, what's the point? So they try and create basically like a shortage. They dump their milk rather than sell it at a loss. And again, creating that kind of a shortage so that maybe prices will go up and then they can stabilize a little bit. Farmers also will declare a farm holiday and refuse to work in the fields. They block roads in order to prevent food from going to market. And again, that belief that food shortages would raise prices. And they also will try to prevent foreclosure on farms by force, by coming out in force and basically forcing the bank to back off. Urban areas will have their own response to the Depression. They begin calling the shanty towns Hoovervilles. They begin wrapping themselves in, or not wrapping, those that used newspapers for blankets, like the homeless on the streets, began calling them Hoover blankets. Cars that no longer had gasoline in them and had to be pulled by horses because that's all you could afford for fuel are called Hoover wagons. And so like empty pockets that were turned inside out to show you had no money were called Hoover flags. And so you can kind of see like they're relating everything back to Hoover, that it's all his fault sort of thing. And so Hoover is really seen as a cold and heartless leader, that he doesn't really care about the American people. So Hoover begins to take more action. He begins to take a more activist approach. He puts federal funds into projects to try and add jobs and get the economy going again, like Boulder Dam. He's going to fund that. He puts into place a public works program, building roads and dams and other large projects, and this will provide jobs for the unemployed. About $800 million is going to be set aside by Congress for this program. He creates the Federal Farm Board, which is going to raise crop prices by helping farm co-ops to buy the crops and keep them off the market temporarily, creating that shortage without actually destroying the product. He creates the National Credit Corporation, which is going to loan money to small banks to try and keep them from going bankrupt. So he does start taking these little tiny steps, but they still fail to turn the economy around because that's just how bad it had gotten. So 1932 rolls around and it's an election year. And with an election year coming up, Hoover needs to start taking some drastic steps in order to get reelected to office. And so he's going to appeal to Congress to pass a series of bills. The first one is the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, and basically going to lower mortgage rates. Farmers will be able to refinance their loans in order to prevent foreclosure. The second bill that he wants passed is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And this is going to provide emergency money for banks and insurance companies and for the railroad and other businesses that were in danger of failing. Now, Hoover believed that this money that he wants through these two bills, that money is going to trickle down to the average person. So he's going to give the money to the corporations or the banks or whatever, and eventually that will trickle down to the average person through jobs and wages. However, critics of his program are going to say that it's only going to benefit the large corporations, and it's going to take too long to get to the poor and the hungry who need it now. The end result for Hoover is that it was just too little, too late. He just had not accomplished enough in order to restore the American public's favor to him. So what kind of puts the last nail in the coffin for Hoover is the Bonus Army. Now, the Bonus Army is going to damage Hoover's image even more. And the Bonus Army was the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the Bonus Army. And it was made up of World War I veterans. And it was the veterans and their families who came to D.C. because Congress was proposing a bill that would pay a bonus to World War I vets. World War I vets had not been paid adequately for their service in World War I. And so this bill going through Congress would give $500 per soldier as to the bonus army, to World War I vets. And it was supposed to have been paid in 1945, so like 15 years in the future. But the leaders believed that it should be paid immediately because of the economic difficulties of the day, that people needed the money now, not 10 years from now. So Hoover at first is very accommodating to this bonus army. They come to D.C. He lets them camp out on the White House lawn and in front of Congress and is very accommodating to them. But then the bill isn't passed by Congress. And so Hoover is going to encourage the soldiers to leave, saying, you did your best. I'm sorry. Maybe go home, find a job, that kind of stuff. And most of them do. But about 2,000 are going to remain in D.C. hoping to meet with the president and come up with some other alternative, maybe a new bill to propose, that kind of stuff. And this makes Hoover very nervous because now he's got 2,000 people who are not happy with him, not happy with the government, and they're camped out on his front doorstep. And so he is going to order them to be disbanded peaceably, to have them basically nicely escorted out of town and sent home. General Douglas MacArthur, that's who Hoover gives this job to disband them peaceably, is put in charge. And he uses force to get rid of the bonus army. He brings in tanks and he gasses the crowd. An 11-month-old baby is killed. An 8-year-old boy is injured. 2 people are shot. A lot of people are injured. And it's just chaos. It's just so unexpected. The American people are just stunned and outraged that this happened. And it basically seals Hoover's fate, because how could you order this? Because Hoover takes the blame for it. He doesn't say, well, I didn't say to do that. I told MacArthur, and he disobeyed orders. MacArthur is basically let off with a lecture. He doesn't really get reprimanded beyond that. Hoover takes all the blame. And it really kills his image, and it's because of that he ends up losing the 1932 election.